with those clients who had dropped out, he found that the majority of those 50% had suffered from childhood sexual abuse. And so they were likely the weight gain was caused from emotional eating. And when your coping mechanism has not been replaced with something healthy, they were probably triggered, so then dropped out. So what he thought was, if this many people in this one scenario, if this is so pervasive in this one scenario, how pervasive is it across the spectrum? So he partnered with the CDC, Dr. Robert Bonda, and together they conducted this landmark epidemiological study of 17,337 participants. And that's huge. For those of you who do research, that's a huge population. So what they were looking for were associations between childhood trauma and health consequences and mental health and social consequences throughout life, their adulthood. And so what they looked at, I guess it's not coming back.
It will in just a second.
It will.
You lost power, so we plugged it up to the extension cord.
Oh, okay.
And I think you're back on Zoom now.
Yeah, I think it's flashing. So I think, did you hit the power button? Yeah, it'll come back on in just a second.
What was the name of that study?
It was the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. Yes. So Felidia and Onda looked at exposure to 10 different types of childhood traumas. Let's see if I can get to that slide so you guys can see it. Okay, yeah. So physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, physical and emotional neglect, parental maltreatment, particularly domestic violence against the mother, household substance abuse, household mental illness, often untreated, parental separation or divorce, incarceration of a household member. So those were the 10 categories that they looked at. Can you think of anything that might have been missing that would be impactful? Yes. Very good. And so I tried to brainstorm to other issues that I was seeing in practice. So what about medical neglect? So parents who do not seek medical care for their children, even though they may have a serious medical problem, like broken bones, and not just fingers and toes, but arms and legs, and they let that heal on its own, and it's often, distorted. So on the flip side of that, and I didn't even list this there, but what about excessive medical care? So when parents take their children to the doctor a lot, and it's maybe indicative of some Munchausen syndrome by proxy. So parents who intentionally may be making their children sick, very traumatic. So what about educational neglect? For those of you in the room who deal with the education system, then you know how important it is to have an education. But recent studies show that among the other factors, that high school dropout rates are directly correlated with incarceration rates. So the prison systems recognize this association, and instead of seeking preventive strategies, they allocate their money to building more jails or expanding jail cells. And so to accommodate this presumptive influx of inmates. So instead of focusing on prevention, the funds are allocated to this presumed eventuality that high school dropouts are going to turn to crime. And that's not necessarily the case, but prevention would have been a better way to spend the money. So what about poverty and food insecurity? It's a scary thing to go hungry, and not just between breakfast and lunch, but a long-term hunger scenario. And then what about residential instability? So when families move so many times, or they're evicted so many times, they often don't even know what or where home actually is. And then homelessness, it leads to that. So often homelessness is traumatic for children, for everyone. And then social isolation. So when families live in dysfunction, they're often enmeshed and they're closed off from segments of society. And so this isolation facilitates some dysfunctional behaviors that often go undetected. So they're kind of closed off to society. What about parentification and parental triangulation? Does anybody know what those terms are? No. Yes, essentially it's role reversal. So the child becomes the parent, or the child takes on a role of one of the parents or the other. And this leads to distortion in the boundaries and the roles all the way across. So we see sometimes that a daughter will take on the role of the wife in every aspect, and having sex with her father, and the whole thing. It's very dysfunctional. So parental triangulation, we see that in very ugly separations and divorces where the parents pit the child against the other parent and force them to take sides. And then there's also forced marriage that occurs. And then, like Eric said, separation by death. And not just, death alone is a traumatic thing for a child, but then you add the layer of, was it suicide or was it homicide? And that's even, more traumatic. So what about some issues that happen outside the family? These are some familial issues. So bullying of any kind. So face-to-face bullying and cyberbullying are very traumatic for children. Social media is a big deal for kids. And so can you imagine that you're being bullied at school, but maybe you're also being victimized in your news feed? So racism and discrimination, oppressive environments are very traumatic. What about community dysfunction? Would you thought community dysfunction is a trauma? How many of you know that your zip code, your place matters, and that your zip code can have some detrimental effects on your health and well-being? And I'm not just talking about living in a war zone, although that's certainly not precluded. But if you think about if you live in an area where the crime rate is so high that you can't feel safe, even in your own home, that's very traumatizing for everyone. What about threats of gang violence and other collective types of violence that happen on a daily basis? What about when there are more liquor stores in your community than there are grocery stores? It speaks to what your community values. So where racism and sexism and other forms of discrimination are part of the fabric of that community, and you can't fit in because of that. So Aristotle, in all of his wisdom, said, "Tell me how a man died, and I'll tell you where he lived." That's kind of sad. So it's not an absolute, of course. There are lots of people who are resilient, who emerge from difficult communities and difficult situations unscathed. But the research consistently suggests that community dysfunction is a remarkable factor in poor outcomes. And then what about sexual exploitation and sexual harassment? So sex trafficking, as we know, is not isolated to large cities and foreign countries. We also know from the Me Too movement that sexual harassment is not uncommon, even at any age or at any gender. So what about forced illegal activity? What do you think I mean by that? Yes. Yes. So drug dealing, drug selling, drug dealing, theft, forced theft. Yes. Yeah. So parents will have their children do it. Forced prostitution. So the whole gamut of forced illegal activity. What about natural disasters? Do you think that's traumatic? So look at Puerto Rico, and this is an American province that experienced this, this horrible hurricane. Hurricane Maria happened over 7 months ago, and still large segments of the whole island are without power. And just last week, it was announced that 253 more schools were closing. And so jobs are lost, homes are destroyed, so families are impacted, certainly. Can you think of any others that may happen on outside the family system? I think that's a pretty, inclusive list. Okay, So some of the findings from the study, they were very astounding. So exposure to diversity doesn't just impact people in ways that you might suspect, like 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in America. And so those impacted brain development, the immune system, the hormonal systems, and can alter our physiology and even change the transcription of our genetic code. I'll try to get to that. Yeah. Do you guys know about epigenetics? Okay. Do you know about it, Bobby? So epigenetics. So epi means on top of, and so toxic stress kind of creates this chromosome called chromatin, and it lays on top of our DNA and modifies the expression of the genetic code. And so it switches on the genetic predisposition to maladaptive behaviors. So things like alcoholism, things that you wouldn't think would be attached to your DNA, but they become this layer of this different aspect. So surprisingly, what Felitti and Onda found were that ACEs were incredibly common, that 2/3 of those more than 17,000 respondents had at least one ACE. And what they also found was that ACEs generally co-occur. So people who had at least one ACE almost always had 2 or more. 40% of the population, of that 17,000 plus population, had 2 or more ACEs, while 12.5% had 4 or more ACEs. That's pretty a large number. And so for individuals with ACE scores of 4 to 6, their relative risk of developing COPD or hepatitis was 2.5 times that of somebody with 0 ACEs. And for depression, it was 4.5 times. For alcoholism, it was 7 times. And for suicidality, it was 12 times. That's a really high number, 12 times that of somebody with 0 ACEs. But then they also had a 20-year decrease in their life expectancy. 20 years, just because of the trauma that they had experienced as a child. And so excess death that we were talking about before. Okay, and so individuals with scores of 7 ACEs or more had triple the risk of developing lung cancer and a 3.5 times risk of developing ischemic heart disease, which is the #1 killer in the US. So the World Health Organization, and I just added the full quote there, states that when viewed through the public health lens, the negative impacts of ACEs are universal when considering a dose-response relationship of these cumulative stressors. So this means that the higher the ACE scores, the more plausible these negative outcomes are. Okay, and so I added some helpful slides, and I shared a link with you guys that you can pull up later about early brain development. And so for the sake of time, I'm going to just give you a synopsis of each. So when you think about architecture and you think about you're building a house, so the foundation is the part that makes everything else work, and everything else is connected. So if the foundation doesn't form correctly, the rest is out of order. The same thing occurs with the brain, and that link sort of gives that information. And then the next is the serve and return and how that builds brain circuitry. So babies are born with billions of neurons, and they're firing. And when we have positive serve and return with a child, it strengthens those synapses and strengthens those connections. But then the lack of the interaction causes those to prune away, and then it just doesn't develop. And then toxic stress derails healthy development. So that is exactly what that implies, that when there's so much stress that the development just cannot occur. Okay. And so when we think about the neurobiological consequences of ACEs, we have to think about the brain centers that are affected. So areas like the nucleus accumbens, it's the pleasure and reward center of the brain. that's implicated in substance dependence. So those of us who treat substance dependence, we see that, and we know that that's an area that we target when we start treatment. And then ACEs also inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which is necessary for impulse control and executive functioning, so thinking, so rational thinking and learning new information occurs there. So the prefrontal cortex actually shuts down during heightened arousal to ensure that there's complete focus on survival. So the brain is incredibly self-preserving, so it does all of these things to try to save our lives. And so the limbic system is the other thing that's impaired, and it's comprised of the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus. The limbic system is the emotional seat of the brain, and it's also impacted by trauma and toxic stress. So consider how that impacts the brain's fear response center when we think about fight, flight, and freeze situations. So to help you have an idea of the neuroanatomical model of the brain, so hold up a hand, any hand, it doesn't matter, okay? So imagine that this area is the brain stem. And so it's responsible for some pretty important functions. So it controls consciousness and wakefulness, so breathing, swallowing. It manages heart rate and blood pressure and those kinds of things that help us function. And so then this part is your spinal column, imagine. And so this is how neurological information is transmitted from the brain to the rest of the body and back again. And then your thumb, consider that might be the limbic system. And so if you fold that over, you can see that there's this very close connection between the brainstem and the limbic system. So there's transmitted communication there back and forth repeatedly. And if you fold your fingers over, so this area is the cortex, and it's oriented like this with the nails to the front. And so this is your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And like I said, this is where impulse control happens, where learning occurs, and that kind of thing. And so when we think about, this is the occipital lobe back here, and these on each side are the temporal lobes. And so the prefrontal cortex is the most prolonged system of development. It takes about 25 years for this system to be completely developed. So what that means is for people who are less than that age, there's an emotional component to everything they do, to their decision making, to everything they do. So you can open your hand back up. And so what we want to see by the time a child grows into adulthood is that there's going to be reciprocity of those brain functions. And we call that the triune brain, the primitive area, the limbic system, and the cortex. So we want those to work together and to help an individual to cope if they have distress or experiencing some kind of other stress. So they reach homeostasis or the steady state. And so this is the foundation of development when we're talking about areas that are profoundly impacted by childhood trauma. So some kids just do not have the ability to develop those healthy attachments because of the trauma that they've experienced, because there's a disconnect between these areas and the cortex. And so what we see are some three critical markers. First, the emotional brain moves into survival mode. And second, that there's poor decision making. And then third, the ability to appraise the present and learn from the past or learn from their experiences is also impaired. And so because of growing up with some significant trauma, we see that the emotional brain literally becomes a survival brain. And so the first aberrant marker that we see is that. And so individuals that have pervasive experiences of fear and feeling unsafe in their bodies and in their relationships that are meant to nurture them and to guide them. So this leaves that individual feeling unsafe in their bodies, in their feelings, and even unsafe with their own thoughts as they try to make sense of what, to them is a very chaotic and dangerous world. And so those individuals consistently rely on the fight, flight, and freeze response. And brain scientists tell us that those automatic responses literally hijack the thinking brain. So this area, the cortex, remember. So it's like a hostile takeover of the conscious mind by these negative and powerful emotions that control how they interact. So we know that survival mode is an instinct that's intended to save our lives, but it's not meant to be how we live our lives. Okay. And then the second thing that we see is poor decision making, so impairment in decision making. The traumatized brain just simply cannot rely on access of that thinking brain to make those rational decisions. So their decision making is very scattered and very poor and has that emotional content to it. And so this is caused by the distortions in the brain's alarm system that registers danger everywhere. So imagine that you're in a war zone and you're hypervigilant. You're thinking that there may be an enemy around any corner. You have this rush of adrenaline and cortisol that's causing your heart to pound. Your pupils dilate for effective acuity. Your airways open up. Blood is diverted from to your extremities and to your muscles to aid in your defense and also to keep you from dying if you get, a body shot that's going to be fatal. And it also helps you to run fast if that's what's going to save your life. And that's effective if you're in a battle and you're facing an enemy. But what if that enemy comes home every night and this system stays activated continuously? So these things that are meant to be life-saving become maladaptive and health and psyche damaging. So children are especially sensitive to this repeated stress activation and what it does to their brains and bodies when they're just in the process of development. So can you imagine how difficult it would be to function, to go to school and to do well and to learn and to develop and be creative if alarm bells are sounding in your brain all the time because of the perception of danger everywhere? And not just in dangerous situations, but in neutral situations and in situations that are good and positive. So it's this confusion of their whole thinking system. So it's a profound interference in the ability to be fully present in the moment and to use those resources that are around you and the relationships that you have available to you. So the third marker that we see in the traumatized brain is the inability to accurately appraise the present and learn from experience. So some say that the traumatized brain is like Velcro for bad and Teflon for good. And so that's a really sad prospect when I think about how our brains become wired to repel positive experiences, but they retain the negative ones. It's such a sad thing. And so this leads us as professionals to possibly have our own wrongful conclusions that people that they can't heal from developmental trauma, or that they somehow are resistant to healing, or that they're not even amenable to our services. So we espouse treatments that are acute in nature, but chronic problems cannot be addressed in the short term. So what is a trauma-informed approach? So when we work with clients, we need to change our way of interacting. So it's a shift from asking what's wrong with you to what happened to you, so that we can hear their stories from their perspective. And how does that continue to live on in your daily life long after that traumatic event has abated? So the trauma-informed approach requires a greater sensitivity and a deepening understanding of the effects of trauma on the brains and bodies of children, and if unresolved, how that will follow them into adulthood. So as a society, we've been reluctant to come to terms with what trauma actually means, and not just for that individual, but for all of society. So as an example, the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, was not recognized and an approved disorder until 1980. Well, I mean, after there's been X number of wars, lots of civil unrest, and so it wasn't even something that the society was able to embrace. So it's always been a very limited diagnosis in that it's not really for children. It was based on an adult's ability to tell us about their experiences, how they were able to cope, and the coping mechanisms that they devised that deeply involved like avoiding any reminder of the trauma, how they would try to suppress those thoughts and those feelings. And anything that gets suppressed and packed down has an eventual explosion. So emotions that are suppressed only serve to get stronger. So imagine that you're on a diet and there's a box of chocolate-covered, cream-filled donuts at the edge of your desk, beckoning. It gets a hold on you, right? So it's something that becomes very strong. In social work, we call that amplification. So it just gets stronger. So internal pain always comes out one way or another. And who pays the price for that? We all do. We all do. So even with some substantiated histories of significant trauma, only about 22% of children ever meet the criteria for PTSD. And it's because that childhood trauma is so exceptionally different in that it happens in the crucible of those early relationships and having those devastating impacts on the person's development. So they can't move from here to here when in their healthy development. So children are impacted differently by trauma, and those early relationships, those child-parent relationships or child-caregiver relationships are essential for healthy brain development. So trauma-informed care is more than just an approach. It's a strategy and a mindset that encourages service providers to be aware of the client's physiological needs, their psychological needs, and their emotional needs. And also for service providers to approach clients from a perspective of empathy and not blame. So when you think about the experiences that they had, think that there's a high possibility that the reason they act the way they do or they experience the things that they've experienced is based on some traumatic event that's occurred. It's also a call for service providers to treat clients with unconditional positive regard. In social work, that's in our code of ethics. That's how we interact with our clients, with unconditional positive regard. And then also that we acknowledge the trauma, and that if our clients are willing to talk about it, that we talk about it with them and not avoid it because it may be uncomfortable for us. You know, we have to meet them where they are, and often that's a very fragile place. We have to allow that. And so optimal human development. So the hope is that for optimal human development by adulthood, a person should be able to reliably and objectively perceive the world, that they can problem solve and plan for the future in a flexible way, and that they can recognize their feelings and tolerate them long enough to manage them and to learn from them, and that they can develop a stable self-identity and self-efficacy because they haven't learned that what their value is. Very early on, they often have some self-esteem issues and some other things that they try to fill that with in negative ways, maladaptive ways. And so that they can form some trusting relationships and rely on those relationships to support them and to assist them when they need that. They haven't had that stability often. And so that often we know that the hurt happens in a relationship, and so the nurturing relationship can bring about healing, and that happens often in therapy. So with all of these accomplishments, they require a healthy and well-regulated brain. So there's a lot of work to do to get them to that place. And developmental trauma affects 1 in 4 children. And that's an exceptionally high number when you think that 25% of children may grow into adults whose life experiences, or their life expectancies rather, are abbreviated by approximately 20 years, and that they're at high risk for health and mental health complications. So lots of fallout just from an unhealthy childhood. So how do we begin to heal brains that are wrapped in pain? So healing has to be a partnership between the survivor and the advocate, or their therapist or their caregiver. And so recognizing and minimizing those power imbalances that occur. We see that there's there's a power differential in treatment. And so trying to level that out. And also to emphasize the survivor's strength and that they can build on those. And then to have a focus on safety and trust. So we want to develop rapport with our clients. And that we have to include those non-traditional collaborations like expanded communities, like faith communities, and friends and family and other helping systems. And that we also have to be culturally sensitive when we work with clients, and all clients, but particularly when they've had experiences like this. So often we use psychodynamic approaches. And so Freud's psychodynamic theory, and I just kind of added the whole thing there, asserts that our behavior and mental issues that we suffer can be traced beyond our conscious self-control, that our subconscious mind and the innate impulses that we may not be aware of are what influence the way in which we behave and are strongly influenced by childhood experiences. So Freud got it back then, he was right about that. So some other things that we use in treatment for trauma is eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing. And this is a physiological therapy that moves the trauma from one part of the brain and out of the body. So there's lots of things that happen that eye movement desensitization reprocessing kind of mimics the REM, rapid eye movement that happens during sleep and that kind of movement. And it helps to sort of separate and help them to rethink the trauma and to add it into a different realm that's in the past and then move them forward into the future so that trauma can help to dissipate. And so neurofeedback is another thing that we use to help move that trauma out of the brain, to shift sides and to develop other aspects of the brain. And then also group attachment-based treatment. So using multidisciplinary treatment teams where everyone in the child's life who can work together, so home, school, therapy, medical aspects, so everybody can have a place in that healing process. And then, and I have it wrong there, I say bottoms up. So the other approach is called the bottom-up approach, not to be confused with the bottoms-up approach. And I add a link there for you guys to check that out so you can understand what that entails, but I'm going to give you a little update on that. So the brain, as we know, is highly plastic and able to change and evolve and to develop new ways of thinking. And so when clients are informed about neuroplasticity, they're very hopeful because there's a chance that they can heal from their trauma. So they start to be very positive in the treatment. So the reason that we use the bottom-up approach is because the brain develops, like we were saying, from the bottom up. And so the brainstem, the limbic system, where the attachments and the emotions and behavior are regulated there. They're not just formed there, but they're regulated there. And then the cortical area is formed. And remember, we were saying that was a critical area for thinking, impulse control, and for learning. And so clients get stuck in the survival loop, and we can help interrupt that so that it's not just this fight or flight or freeze thing over and over and over. And so with targeted assessments, we know reasonably where we can start when we understand that. So when trauma has occurred while children are developing, they get stuck in that primitive area of the brain, and the higher parts of the brain just fail to develop properly, and that inhibits learning. That's important to know, especially for people who teach young children and they can't get it. So they need a lot of extra help, maybe some more aggressive types of help, even from your side that you collaborate with other systems that, help. So like I said, that's probably why many of the children that I saw in treatment said that they hated school because they couldn't get it and they couldn't learn, and it was such a challenge for them. And so the bottom-up approach focuses on attachment problems that fail to develop early on, some self-esteem issues that they may be suffering, and then dissociative features that occur, and then other cognitive problems that affect the cortical and the limbic systems of the brain. So emotional regulation therapy is also something that's implicated, that we want to work with that, some behavioral modification. And then there's the neurosequential model of therapies. So this uses a specific order for treating those traumas, and that's helpful to like systematically work with that. But there's, all of that is great and wonderful, but prevention is the best solution. So effective parenting classes that we can offer. Babies do not come with a manual. Respite care for stressed out parents. So give them a break so that they can get it together. And then group therapy is helpful to normalize the situation so that they don't feel like it's just me and nobody else suffers this. But education in school before parenthood begins is helpful. And then also mentoring and relationship building. So there were these two guys who were fishing, and they're on the riverbank and they're fishing, and then a baby floats down the river. And the one guy drops his pole and he runs into the river and he pulls the baby, and the baby's alive. He pulls the baby out, and then before he can come out of the river, another baby comes down, and then another. And his friend drops his pole and he runs up the stream. And the other fisherman who's in the water trying to catch the babies, he says, I need your help. I need your help. And he says, where are you going? And the other guy says, I'm going upstream to find out who's throwing the babies in the river and to put a stop to it. So that guy was thinking about prevention, and the other guy was dealing with the situation at hand, which was overwhelming him. And for now, we have to think about both. We have to think about how we deal with it and then how we can prevent that. And then eventually, if we're successful here, the prevention can be the primary treatment. We can focus there. All right. Well, I'll just skip right past that. Okay, and so then, sadly, there is not one full treatment that deals with the full catastrophe of childhood trauma, but several varied approaches that are helpful. So we can teach people about forgiveness, and as a Christian, I know that there's merit in that there's value there, but it's a hard sell for many of our clients who have just not arrived at that place yet. So we can respond to our clients empathically, and this keeps us out of judgment. And empathy is feeling with others and seeing things from their perspective. And I list a video there that's entertaining and insightful from Brene Brown about sympathy versus empathy. And that's empathy very rarely does a response start with, well, at least you made it to this point, So we avoid that. We stay out of judgment with our clients. And so there's so much research that's available to us to facilitate our understandings of trauma and the mechanism of it. We now know not only which pathways are disrupted, but how. And so our jobs is to use the science for prevention and for treatment, and to tailor that in a way that recognizes that some of our clients may need more aggressive care. And so how we frame an issue is important, and it dictates how we prioritize it, the resources that we allocate to it, and the policy choices that surround it. So on your table, you'll see the ACEs study from the original 1995 study. And you can take it, but you don't have to announce your score. You don't have to share it with anybody. But do this just for your own knowledge of what your relative risk may be. Did you get one, Crystal? Okay, all right. So it's because insight is so important, because there's never a hit like the one you don't see coming. And it's so fundamental. And for individuals with really high ACE scores, the hits just keep coming for them. And so I listed several research projects that are underway. So I was very pleased to see that there is hope for improvements in treatment protocols, and that the hope that there's more disciplines who will interface with children on a multidisciplinary team approach will emerge to sort of help with that prospect. So we cannot continue to turn a blind eye to these very powerful findings and operate in the same way that we have and expect these very few positive results when there's not enough care to go around. You guys might recognize the first picture. That's Albert Einstein. And so it was Einstein who said, if we continue to do the same thing, in the same way and expect a different result, what is that? It's insanity. That's insanity. Okay, but the other picture is Mom's Mabley, and for those who are familiar with her, you might like her paraphrase of that statement a little better. So she says, if you do what you always did and you get what you always got and you keep doing that, you crazy. So they understood that if it's not working, you have to do something else. Okay, and so we all must be invested. So being trauma informed is not just an essential focus for social workers or for educators, but for all of us. So ACEs impact us all, either directly through some personal experiences or indirectly through our membership in society. So if we fail to just do anything about it, we are all impacted. So we must all be invested in being an answer to this problem that's so endemic. And each of us have our platforms, and a platform is nothing more than a raised position of what you would do on the floor. So you have your own sphere of influence, and so when you share this information, hopefully everybody becomes invested. So it's a call to action to do something, and we have to be responsible to take that step. And so once we arrive at that place of awareness, there's no going back to that place of unknowing. So in the words of the great prophet Mufasa, we are all, wait a minute, let me do my best, James Earl Jones, we are all connected in the great circle of life. So there's no them or us, there's only us. And then when you go home, you're going to want to watch Lion King. So when we understand the mechanism of a problem, and we do, and we can develop interventions to intervene and to interrupt and to change those outcomes. And so for us, that's pivotal. We can be at a tipping point to change the future. So I'm going to leave you with this one last bit of information. So I do some prison ministry, and this is a picture of an inmate as a child, and he gave this picture to me, and he gave me permission to share his story. But for his confidentiality, I'll call him John. And he told me a little bit about his life with this story around this and how he ended up in prison. He said that in this picture and it's very blurry. It was so small, and when I tried to scan it, it just is blurry. So he said in this picture he was about 4 years old, and at this point, his father had been sexually abusing him for almost a year. This went on for the next 6 years before his father passed away. And so John would tearfully tell me about the sadistic and violent things that his father would do to him and say to him, not just do to him, because there's abuse across all spectrums. He told me about when he was 6 and his father had beaten him so bad that he had an orbital blowout. You guys know what that means? He got hit in the eye, and it broke all the bones around his eye. But Monday morning, he was sent to school, nevertheless, covered in bruises. So his father had told him that his grandfather, his paternal grandfather, had done those same things to his father. And so that pattern was repeated. So there was pain and degradation and shame and anger and that maltreatment that just continued. When John was 12, he started fighting and skipping school, doing drugs, vandalizing property, and beating his mom because he thought, he was for certain that his mother knew what his father was doing to him, and she failed to protect him. When he was 18, he raped a child, and it didn't stop there. So he raped women, he raped other children, males and females. It didn't matter to him. So his decision making was completely impaired. And I'm not making an excuse for his violence. These were his choices, and they were evil. And he deserves to be put away and separated from anybody else that he could harm. But after knowing what happened to him and how his brain was predisposed to the abuse that was inflicted on him, it's sad that he wasn't protected as a child. what if somebody had intervened with him early on? I mean, how could it be that no one noticed this little boy coming to school covered in bruises and smelling of urine because he was afraid to get up to go to the bathroom at night, fear of waking his father? So if you help an abused child, you could be preventing a lifetime of pain, and not just for one person, but look at all the lives that it impacted that because this was neglected. So for me, this case reinforced that we are all connected. And by turning a blind eye to situations like this and others, that we're not just abandoning ourselves and that child, but everyone else. Thank you for listening. You guys have any questions about anything?
Similar for children will do things like this. Have like really negative effects on that. Are we going to find that that's actually somewhat higher in high poverty areas where there's a lot of low socioeconomic status?
The research certainly supports that. The data does bear that out. That situations where there's high poverty, that there's high lots of other things. When people are stressed out, when it's hot. Exactly, they're only in survival mode. Thank you. Yeah, well, I think it's pervasive around the world, and that because the World Health Organization is involved, and they see the impacts globally, that it is a pervasive, endemic problem. Yeah.
Can the brain go back after it's been stuck in survival mode with treatment? Can it go back and continue to grow further?
Absolutely, and that's because the brain is so plastic, and that neuroplasticity with the ability to change, and it takes a lot of time. And when we say in 6 to 8 weeks, this is your treatment plan, I mean that's unrealistic, and it's a disservice to our clients when we do that, because it's not something that can be taken care of in the short term. When you think about Erickson, you guys know about Erickson, and he talked about how those psychosocial stages occur, and so trust versus mistrust, and that happens the very first stage. And if you can't reconcile one, you become the other. But you can go back and fix that. And I think there was a point when Erickson's theory was very rigid, and people thought that this is your lot in life, and you can't fix it. But that's been disproven. Thank you.
I know about the fight fly,
Mm-hmm.
but that freeze, what is that freeze? I mean, I have an idea what it is.
Right.
Yeah, but like just numb.
Oh yeah, and just stop. You can't respond. You can't run. You can't fight. You just stop. And when in scientific realms where research has been done on mouse models, when they impaired the auditory system on the mouse, it would just freeze, and so it wouldn't run from. The freeze response was effective for that population because the predator wouldn't attack it. It would just kind of didn't see it. But in human models, if we freeze, it can be a fatal decision. And so there's a circuitry that occurs when there's a stimulus. So if you're scared by something, it either goes to the short circuit through the thalamus to the amygdala, and it gives you that fight, flight, or freeze, or it goes in almost instantaneously, just fractions of seconds. It goes from the stimulus through the thalamus to the sensory cortex, where it can make sense of that. Remember the rational thinking, and that it can tell the amygdala that there's no threat to be concerned about. But in our clients who have not healthily formed this area, it goes from the thalamus to the amygdala, and then it's like that response over and over where your heart is pounding, and it causes such detrimental impacts on their health and their psyche. I don't know about that one, that they may freeze in that area.
Yeah, they just like freeze in this area and they don't know.
Yeah.
They don't know whether it's 5, they don't know whether it's 5, they don't know
And especially if it's a repeated thing, that they kind of become conditioned to that, they're just not going to do anything. And that may be what also saves them. And so with my clients who were teenagers, who were self-harmers, and they would consistently say that they didn't feel anything. And so to be able to feel something again, they would cut, and very sad
Yeah, I guess
prospect.
that's where
Yeah.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
they shut down.
Yes.
They're there, they like not exist.
Right. Yeah. And so when I was talking about how the brain shuts down, the cortex shuts down so that there's complete focus on survival, and that's where they're stuck, is right here, and they can't get to here to rationalize what's happened to them. So they develop all kinds of maladaptive behaviors. So yes, definitely. Thank you.
I see hospital trauma, like recently a car wreck with young people. You'll see all three of those. Like one person would just lay there, solid, just don't move, and another one will be fitted in. And I want out of here. I want to go out right now.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll see that trauma, especially in emergency rooms.
Mm-hmm.
You'll see all three of them all the time.
Yes. All right. Well, thanks so much, you guys. I appreciate it. And if you have any other questions, my email is on one of these forms. I'm happy to answer anything later, too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This court.